Evening, everyone. Welcome to a pre-recorded episode of a valued conversation, Gen X Spoken Word. Find somebody who knows somebody to tell somebody about what's going on over here. If you like it, let me know. Share it if you do. Subscribe if this is what you're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and just be blunt right about now. You know who I am. You know what we do here. So let's not fuck about. We are literally looking at the point in society right now, whereas people are pretty much being dismissive of facts, reality, and shared value. People are literally picking and choosing what they want to believe and then discarding what doesn't fit their particular narrative. I want you to think about this. About 30, maybe 40 years ago, if a politician was running for office and said something in public, such as grab him by the pussy, that person's political career would have been over then and there because of a level of value the country used to have. This would not have been tolerated. Again, that shared values being dismissed. If we look at facts that are being dismissed, a black woman by the name of Candace Owens can say another black woman, Kamala Harris, former vice president of the United States, was not black. And people jumped on that and actually believe this nonsense. Again, this is a dismissal of facts. Last and not least, let's look at the dismissal of reality. January 6, 2021, a full on riot, insurrection. But yet you had the audacity of conservatives to say it was just another normal tourist visit to the Capitol, just another day of business, tourist visits. And on top of that, the audacity to call it legitimate political discord, the dismissal of reality. How do we get this far? How did this even happen? Now, about a week or so ago, I released a video that discussed how Russia was looking at trying to infiltrate America and undermine the principles that America stood for, the core values, you name it. Basically, subverting the ideology of the United States so it would make the US more susceptible to listen to Russian propaganda. And this was viewed as being psychological warfare or active measures. Now, it was about 40 something years ago where a KGB defector by the name of Yuri Bezmenov gave an interview stating that Russia was actively targeting the United States to try and change our values and our views so it'd fall again more in line with Russia. So, therefore, Russia would have the ability to pump information into American society and corrupt whatever our views were at the time. Now, excuse me for a moment, my phone keeps going off. Hate to be a bad host. I thought I turned this off. All right. I hope it's nothing important. If anyone is trying to call me right now, send me a text message, call, or something like that. If it is important, I'll get back to it. Otherwise, let's get back on to the show here. So, one of the things that Bezmenov talked about is that we back then in the 80s looked at everything that the Russians were doing as being an ongoing act of espionage. When in fact, as Bezmenov stated, all that time was not put towards espionage. 85% of its efforts, as he stated, was put towards trying to subvert the will of the United States as far as our pastimes of, again, goals and our ideologies. And he said it would take place through 4 stages, or actually, I shouldn't say it was taking place. We just couldn't see it because it was supposed to happen and appear as nothing was going on, although it's just a slow leak. Now, we all know what a slow leak is like. Eventually, there's a buildup from the slow leak in a closed area or a confined area. But as large as US is with our communications, with our attitudes that seem to shift and change with every coming fad, Russia knew that it was going to be a long-term goal. So the first stage was demoralization. And under demoralization, that meant that the process that needed to take place was to remove truth or the belief in truth. Russia said they needed to make sure that anything that is stated that is fact needed to be believed to be fiction. completely remove the ability to discern fact from fiction, false, truth, take it all away. Once you're able to do that, you don't know which way is up, which way is down. Nothing can be believed. You can drop a pile of books with the answers in front of someone, physically take them to a location and say, hey, look at this. This is a concentration camp. No, it's not. You would not be able to get the individual to believe that no matter how much truth you put in front of them until it happened to them. The second stage was destabilization. Destabilization was built across the strategy that it would take 15 to 20 years to change the next generation. So we're talking from K through 12 up to probably even undergrad, but still 15 to 20 years is what Russia felt it would take to subvert the next generation of Americans. The third stage was crisis, and crisis could be injected into a society, and it could take anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 weeks before that crisis will completely overtake the nation. And the fourth stage was normalization, which is where I think everyone can look around right now and somehow believe that we've gotten to a point where actions that we never would have tolerated as a country 30 or 40 years ago have become daily occurrences. Again, grabbing by the pussy, a dismissal of shared values. Kamala Harris is not a black woman, a dismissal of fact. And the third thing, January 6th, it's just a normal tourist day and a normal tourist visit. The dismissal of reality. Think about those three things, all right? Now, then it occurred to me that what if the subversion that I'm thinking of or we're putting on Russia actually started before Russia even got involved? So I know I've taken about 5 or 6 minutes to ramble on here, but I want to set the stage because we're going to be talking about ideological subversion, all right, where we are subverting people's reality and getting them to believe something that, although may not be true, with enough time and enough reinforcement, people will accept it as truth and you can't tell them different, all right? This is going to sound hyperbolic. The topic of today's show is the South has risen again. Call me crazy, but I want you folks to actually look at what's going on right now. There's talk that the Smithsonian exhibit of Black history is going to be taken down. At least Trump wants that to be changed because, oh, it's divisive. Think about this. Someone who has been pointed out as being a known racist is classifying people who are formerly enslaved and freed for about 100 and some odd years as being racist. Black people, yes, we can be racist, but that exhibit is not racist. That is reality. But we see an attack on that. We've seen attacks on voting rights back in 2013. We're looking at attacks on, as of right now, the misappropriated terms such as DEI, which had nothing to do with blacks. But still, it has been associated with Black culture. All right, this type of targeting that we're seeing right now. If you stop and think about it, let's imagine that the last presidency, which was Joe Biden's administration, let's imagine that that was Reconstruction. All right, let's imagine the Reconstruction period. And recall now, Reconstruction is where formerly enslaved people were now freed and were being integrated into society, namely into Southern society, being that they lost the war. And now let's recall at the end of Reconstruction period, where the compromise was made with Rutherford B. Hayes saying that he is going to, or I shouldn't say he was saying, but the agreement made between the Southern Democrats and the Republicans is that if we remove the Union troops from the South, even though there was a tie between Hayes and I believe Tilden, I can't think of his first name, but he also ran for the presidency at that point in time back in 1875 or 1876. Nonetheless, the agreement was that the Republicans could have the presidency, but the Southern Democrats wanted the Union troops moved out of the Southern states. And as soon as that occurred, all the advancements that have been made in between the years of, we'll say, 1866 and 1877 was removed. And then we saw Jim Crow laws come into effect. Any advancements that was made for The advancing of Black people in society was literally wiped out and put to the side. Think about what we're seeing happening right now. A lot of reversals, a lot of precedents that have been put in place are now being moved off to the side. All right, so I've made my general statement here. Like I said, it took me a while to get there, but I wanted to make sure I laid some type of foundation that we can work off of. So it is my distinct belief that we're seeing right now that the distortion of fact, of shared values and reality, this started long before Russian propaganda. I believe right now what we're looking at is the long-term end goal, although it's not over just yet, but still the long-term end goal of the Confederacy, one to ensure that the lost cause narrative was perpetuated, pushed through history to whereas when the opportunity presented itself, if they got an opening to where they could try and institute any and all type of policy that benefited the Confederate state of mind, they would do that. And I think that is what's going on right now. But I'll give you information that will let you decide for yourselves. All right, first and foremost, before we get started, now you all know that I like to make sure that there's a means of fact checking that I do so everyone has the ability to either look at this from the perspective that I'm presenting, or you look at it, take what I've given, and then take it upon yourself to further educate yourselves. So there are numerous sites out here that anyone can go to, but I happen to chose the College of Staten Island because I just like the layout of the information they provided. So if you want to, make sure you check the URL above. This is the information that you can follow. No need for me to put that inside of the description. But nonetheless, I want you guys to make sure that whatever I say, don't take it for face value. Check for yourselves. So we have a look at what misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation look like because they all intersect. Misinformation, unintentionally published inaccurate or misleading information. Disinformation, deliberately fabricated or manipulated information. And malinformation, deliberately published sensitive private information with altered text. So we can, as I said, see for ourselves that there's something wrong here if we take a look at shared values, fact, and reality. It is being distorted. Now, the next question we should ask ourselves is how do we spot fake news? All right, and here's how you go about that. You need to consider the source. By the way, additional information is beneath, which you guys are capable of reading for yourselves, obviously. Consider the source. Read beyond. Check the author. Are there supporting sources? Check the date of the article. Is it a joke? Check your biases. That's the main thing you need to make sure you do because we all know that there are folks who are right biased, left biased, and then there's some who sit in the middle. And then, of course, the last thing is ask the experts. Now, as most of you know, I am big on fact checking. Facts don't choose sides. That's just the literal case of it right now. They do not choose sides, nor do facts run away from the truth. Facts are not here to support fiction. Although there are folks who have been able to take narratives that they prop up with their opinion, and then at the end of some type of long winded diatribe or unsubstantiated stream of consciousness that has name dropping and maybe even the current affairs, they switch all this together, push it around, drop it on you, and then say, hey, look, I just gave you a fact. No, you just gave me a long, drawn out narrative of a perspective that you support. You got to watch for that. But again, these are the sources that I want you guys to rely on and use to help you pull, as I say, the bullshit out of the pile. And let's see if we have also websites that you can use to assist you. All right, so here's some websites for fact checking. Now, some of these you've already seen me utilize and even do reviews of, but still it never hurts for you to go back and take a second look. We have PolitiFact, factcheck.org, Washington Post Fact Checker, Snopes, Fact check from Duke Reporters Lab. I've never used that, but again, this is just another source you can utilize. Side check, flag check, and of course, one of my favorites that you see me use if you go back and take a look at videos that I will share in the description, media bias fact check. And of course, there's also NPR fact check. Now, these are sources that will help you, for more or less a better expression, root out the nonsense that sits out there. But these things are of no use. Let me make sure I look at you guys. This stuff is of no use if you don't take it upon yourself to use it. You can't be scared to be that one person to disagree. But if you are going to disagree, you need to make sure that what you're using is going to be substantial to back your case. Anyone can come up here and say, oh, that's just a bullshit stat. And so, I remember I looked at this article and this article says such and such. And when I hear what it says, then I think about what I felt. And then you just get caught in this loop here where, again, you have an unsubstantiated stream of consciousness that's allowed to run unfettered. And we're talking bloviation and pontification, just wah, talking, but nothing substantiates it. However, by the time that individual is done, he or she says, well, those are the facts. No, again, that is perspective that has not been proven. Don't let yourselves get caught into that. One more thing I want to do here. Let me show you where I'm going to pull the majority of my information from today. And that's going to be from Britannica. Now, the reason why I chose Britannica, boom, pro science. And the factual reporting from this site is listed as being high. These sources consist of legitimate science or are evidence-based through the use of credible scientific sourcing. Legitimate science follows the scientific method, is unbiased, and does not use emotional words. These sources also respect the consensus of experts in the given scientific field and strive to publish peer-reviewed science. Some sources in this category may have a slight political bias, but adhere to scientific principles. Now, notice slight political bias, but it doesn't say to the right or to the left. So this means that a person cannot look at what's provided in Britannica and say, oh, they're left leaning. Oh, they're right leaning. It states that there's a bias, but it doesn't say to which side. So it still puts it firmly in the center. Now, if we also take view, let me put you guys back on this. Again, factual reporting. You have very high and you have high. Then below that, mostly factual, mixed, low, and very low. But if we look at the rating that's been provided for this site, we can see that it is sitting high with credibility. So we know we're going to be okay with any information we find here. Now, I may also utilize information from Wikipedia, which I've done in the past. Now, Wikipedia is accused of being left-leaning. However, there's still a good amount of information that is true if you take the time to cross-reference. So I'm not going to say that Wikipedia is just a toilet for left-leaning organizations. I will say that information that is put in there not only can be true, but you may have folks who may inject false information. And that's why people have a tendency to try and steer away from Wikipedia, because anyone has the ability to add information. Doesn't mean that it is true. However, if you take the time to cross-reference what you find in Wikipedia, you can still see that Wikipedia is quite useful for any information gathering that you need to do. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. I think I've said enough. So again, as I stated before, we are looking at the South as having risen again. So where's the best place to start? Let's start in the Reconstruction period. So before the end of the Civil War, you had a party that was in the Republican Party, or should I say a faction, that was called the Radical Republicans. Now, the Radical Republicans wanted to ensure that slavery was eradicated from the United States. They wanted it up, ended, and gone. So I'm going to mention information that's going to be able to be cross-referenced between, Wikipedia and Britannica. Now that we're looking at Britannica, the radical Republican, during and after the American Civil War, a member of the Republican Party committed to emancipation of enslaved people and later to the equal treatment and enfranchisement of the freed African Americans. So here's something else that I also need to set the tone for that I forgot to put out first and forehand. The Republican Party that we see right now and the Democratic Party that we see right now, these two parties swapped ideologies back in the 1960s. This is an argument that you're going to see put up each and every time you speak to someone who most likely is someone who has had their reality subjugated by the lost cause translation. And that's the Confederacy saying that, oh, we didn't fight the Civil War because of slavery. We fought it because of states' rights. Oh, well, the North was just being aggressive against the South. All this type of stuff that you see that is a lie. It is a myth. The Civil War was fought based upon slavery. But we saw that in most cases, or we saw in this case, the losers got to write the narrative. But I'll save that. Just understand there's going to be a point where we look at the discussion of where the party ideologies of the Republicans and the Democrats swapped. So again, going back to this, the radical Republicans want to make sure that the African Americans were given their freedom because they were still viewed as men. Now, throughout this, you're also going to need to take note here that during the course of the Reconstruction that took place after the end of the Civil War, there were a lot of what's the way to put it? You had a lot of I want to say assertions, but that's still not the right word. You had people who did not want to see the Reconstruction era take place as it did. I'll just have to give another way to explain this. So let's look at it from the standpoint that Abraham Lincoln, towards the end of the war, he wanted to institute what he called the 10% plan. But the problem with the 10% plan is that it was not as aggressive as the radical Republicans wanted to see put against the South for slavery. Now, during the course of this 10% plan that Lincoln wanted to institute, he was assassinated. So before he was able to do such, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. And in doing so, the vice president, who was a Democrat, Andrew Johnson, because there was a party ticket where Abraham Lincoln ran with a Democratic partner, for lack of a better word, and they won in a combined ticket. But after Lincoln's death, I think it went back to being just a simple thing of Republicans ran with Republicans, Democrats ran with Democrats. So I shouldn't say I think, it did. But nonetheless, after the death of Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat, took over, and he was more in line to follow the 10% policy that Lincoln wanted to institute, which again, from the perspective of the radical Republicans, was not radical enough. Now, key thing here, just so people also understand, Republicans back in the day, they were the good guys. Don't look at the standards that we have right now, but back then, prior to 1965, the Republicans were the good guys and the Democrats were absolute ass. All right, these were the diehard slave owners, just like there were Republicans in the North and South who owned slaves, but the Democrats from the South stood on racial business. They were the absolute worst. So, as a Democratic Party and party members, we've got to own that. The Democrats were the bad guys. And Andrew Johnson was about making sure that the bad guys still had a leg up. So, therefore, when we looked at the Reconstruction era taking place, Johnson was more or less in favor of supporting the Southern Democrats, aka the soon to be segregationists. Now, at the end of the Civil War, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but this was part of Reconstruction, right? And I'm just going to get this up here. Being that it was part of Reconstruction, you had bills that were passed because of this. You had the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. So, pardon me while I grab my notes here because there's a lot to talk about. I'm going to try and do this in a brief and concise factor as best as I can. All right, so looking at the Reconstruction period, again, we're talking about the reintegration of blacks or the integration of blacks into society after the war, mainly Southern society, so they can be a part of the American dream, so to speak, or at least whatever was considered back then. But ideally, Reconstruction consisted around allowing blacks to be integrated into society. So, as I said, you had the Civil Rights Act of 1866. What did that do? All right. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 declared all persons born in the U.S. citizens, granted them equal rights to own property, make contracts, and it provided federal protection regardless of race or previous servitude. So, for those of you who did not know, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not the only one. So, this is what you get when you look at higher education, or if the right question is asked, you pursue it. Now, as a side note, let's also think about in today's society where people are being steered away from higher education. Some are saying, oh, the cost is not worth it. But what if it is the simple thing of if people are not obtaining additional knowledge past grade school or past high school, then that means that these individuals are more susceptible to believe what's being told to them. Keep that in mind, folks. Learn for yourselves. Again, as I said, there were three amendments that were a part of the Reconstruction era. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment addressed racial inequality, ensured civil rights for formerly enslaved people. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So we're looking at all this that is coming into play that is giving blacks the ability to be a part of society, but not, excuse me, not only just be a part of society, but be able to participate and add value. But we have to remember, we're still talking about Southern landowners who have just lost their workforce, but then are turning around looking at the people that were just working for them, that they were able to administer control over, now sitting next to them in public places, being able to walk into banks and do business with them, stand in line next to them. This is still a sentiment that Southerners did not want to see. So, as I said here, I've already read across what the 1866 Civil Rights Act was, but again, this information can be found with Britannica. All right, so again, here's the 13th Amendment that I just read out to you guys here. And let's go with the 14th Amendment. So I'm doing this just to make sure that if anyone wants to take a look for themselves, you can either type it in or you can just follow the links in the video. And last, we have the 15th Amendment. Now, moving along here, folks. Again, I don't want you to think that I'm skipping past anything, but I'm trying to condense this down here as much as possible so I don't get too long winded because I know a lot of people don't like to look at information that goes past 15, 20 minutes, much less an hour or so. So I'm going to try and shoot for that. All right. All right. So as we go along here, I mentioned about the assassination of Lincoln. So after Lincoln was assassinated, then Andrew Johnson came in to the position of president. He favored the Southern Democrats. Therefore, he wanted to do what he could to make sure that anything that made the South's integration or living through the Reconstruction period easy to deal with, he would do that. So, of course, he was a sympathizer. So he was going to do what he could to make sure that the Southern Democrats did not suffer greatly at the hands of reconstructive amendments. After Johnson, there came Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Ulysses S. Grant was considered to be a better general than he was a president. So, throughout the Reconstruction period, he was seen as being ineffectual. So, he was not seen to stand up to a lot of the marauding that had started, where you had a lot of attacks that were going on against former enslaved people. Now, a lot of that was due to the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan was formed by Confederate soldiers at the end of the Civil War. The Ku Klux Klan was not formed by the Democratic Party, nor was the Ku Klux Klan a military wing of the Democratic Party. But you will find documentation out here that will say these things because, again, it is part of the lost cause narrative of the Confederacy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, throughout the Reconstruction period, you had attacks on blacks to include whites who supported initiatives to allow emancipated or formerly enslaved people to be integrated into society. But during this course in time, you had education that blacks were participating in. You had government that blacks were participating in. You had education, government, again, land ownership. What can I say? You had a boom of advancement that blacks were a part of, even when it came to inventions, things of this nature. You had a lot of value that was being seen. But again, because of the fact they were former slaves, there were a lot of white Southerners who said, okay, you know what? I think the black folks are doing too much. You Republicans are allowing too much to take place here. All right, we need to stop this. We need to do something about this. But it took a slow burn until roughly about 1875 or the election of 1876, where both candidates, Rutherford B. Hayes and I can never think of Tilden's last first name, but Tilden were both declaring themselves winners. But there was something that needs to be done in order to make sure that there was not going to be this disruption in politics at the time. So there was a compromise. So if you were to look up this information on Wikipedia, I think they called it the Reconstruction Compromise. But verify that anyone who wants to figure that out. I could be wrong, but nonetheless, it was still a compromise nonetheless. Now, inside of Britannica, they called it the Wormley Conference. It's still one and the same, just named differently, because the compromise that was struck between the Democrats and the Republicans was done at the Wormley Hotel. So the basis of the Wormley Conference here was that both men had declared victory for the election of 1876. Now, in declaring victory, only one obviously could be president. So here's the compromise that was made. The Southern Democrats said that, or the Democratic Party said that we will allow your guy, we will allow your guy to be the president if you take the Union troops out of the South. That was the deal. Now, everybody wanted Reconstruction to be over and done with. So, as a result of agreeing to this, when Hayes took the presidency, the first thing they did was remove the troops from the southern states. And as soon as they did that, any and all improvements and achievements made towards the emancipated people was wiped, undercut, and thrown away. Again, so here's the information that I'm discussing. I'm kind of paraphrasing here, taking information from what we see here in Britannica, but there's still information that you can find right here if you want to look deeper in that, which I suggest you do. So, with the end of Reconstruction period came Jim Crow, where now we are looking at hardcore segregation behavior, where eventually they come up with this statement, separate but equal. Yeah, let's go ahead and do this. I need to practice my reading anyway. In 1877, the newly inaugurated President Rutherford B. Hayes removed the last armed troops from the former Confederate States of America. Since the end of the war, military outposts had been placed throughout the South to distribute aid, maintain order, and ensure that residents adhered to the newly implemented Reconstruction Amendments, being what I mentioned before: the 13th abolished slavery, the 14th granted citizenship regardless of race, and the 15th, which granted the ability to vote regardless of race. All Southern states were required to ratify these three amendments before they could re enter the United States. However, there were factions of the South that disagreed with these new amendments and equality between Black and white individuals. As the Reconstruction era ended in 1877 and oversight lessened, many wanted to recreate the antebellum race relations between Black and white individuals. In order to recreate this social status, Jim Crow laws were established that limited African Americans' political and social rights in the Southern states. This era of racial discrimination lasted well into the 20th century and did not end until 1965. Now, keep in mind now, at the end of 1965, we had already had the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which started, or should I say, hastened the migration of the segregationists from the Democratic Party over to the Republican Party. Now, again, I will prove that later on. But also at the end of 1965, or towards the end, you had the Civil Rights, as you were, you had the Voting Rights Act that was passed. So this is significant towards the ideology switch that we'll speak of shortly. Now, I want you to take a look here where Jim Crow was supposedly a slave who had physical ailments, but still depicted as enjoying his life and loved being a slave. Mm-hmm. Now, going forward from this, now recall I just spoke of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Again, the Klan was not the military wing of the Democrats. Now, if anything, they shared the similar values with the Democratic Party. And that was ideally their dislike of Blacks being free and being roaming about in the South amongst their women. So this is just a quick search of the Ku Klux Klan here that I've done just to share with you, where you will see where it states that the Ku Klux Klan was not founded by the Democratic Party. And you'll find all types of information where people will simply say, no, the Democratic Party did not fund the KKK. However, you always have that one or two who will attempt to say different. So what you have here, the inconvenient truth about the Democratic Party, founded the Ku Klux Klan. So no, there is no truth in that. But as I said before, there is a narrative. And for those of you who may not remember or may not have heard it at all, because again, you may have gone to school in the southern region of America where there were textbooks that specifically showed the Civil War to have been wrongly fought for the wrong reasons. And the wrong reason was slavery. Instead, these books say that it was states' rights, and it romanticizes the Southern loss in the Civil War. So what you end up having here are folks who've been brought up for 100+ years, depending on where you went to school and what textbooks you followed, that the South lost a war that never should have fought because they were standing up for their rights as a state, their states' rights, Southern rights. So it is romanticized throughout history that the South is benevolent towards their slaves, that slaves enjoyed having masters, that their lives couldn't have been any better because of the fact of their benevolent masters. God damn. But anyhow, I'm going to have a separate video that I'll do on this particular entry right here. Let's do this real fast. So this is an entry from a university. And this is just taking a quick look here where it talks about what the Democrats did as far as making sure that they supported the Ku Klux Klan, because here we go. In effect, the Klan was a military force serving the interests of the Democratic Party. Now, as I said before, just because of the fact that you had Confederate soldiers who were also voting Democrats did not mean the Democratic Party formed or even sponsored the Ku Klux Klan. They just had shared interests. Let's beat down these ninjas. Now, throughout this, I want you to take note here that you don't see any mention of Barry Goldwater. Now, Barry Goldwater is going to be a primary um, fuse to what causes blacks to start voting from Republican to Democrat. But what I want to put here is that PragerU is responsible for this misinformation that we're looking at right now. There's a perspective that they utilize. Again, this is not the time and place for it, but understand that I will follow up with this in a separate video. So what comes to reason here again is that the Ku Klux Klan, as I said, was not created by the Democrats. Right? They did not found it. But if we go through still, you can find more information to where if you've seen in history, if you recall, Ted Cruz back in 2017 made the statement, the Democrats are the party of the Ku Klux Klan. No, they are not. They never have been. There were shared interests. But hey, look, good old PolitiFact back here to make sure we right the ship. No, the Democratic Party didn't create the Ku Klux Klan. Democrats created the Ku Klux Klan. Logical Fact says false. Now, the History Channel even went as far as providing information of stating what the Klan's origin was, as well as who were the members and facts. Again, more information that goes into describing who the Klan was, who founded it, and who the members were. Founded in 1865, the Ku Klux Klan extended into almost every southern state by 1870 and became a vehicle for white southern resistance to the Republican Party's Reconstruction era policies aimed at establishing political and economic equality for Black Americans. Its members waged an underground campaign of intimidation and violence directed at white and Black Republican leaders. Though Congress passed legislation designed to curb Klan terrorism, the organization saw its primary goal, the reestablishment of white supremacy, fulfilled through Democratic victories in state legislatures across the South in the 1870s. Now you can also see where it talks about the founding, and it states here a group including many former Confederate veterans founded the first branch of the Ku Klux Klan as a social club in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865. Now, as I've mentioned before in different videos, I am from Tennessee. So I knew at 12 years of age from the history book we had at the time for Tennessee called Our Tennessee, I knew and many others knew that the Ku Klux Klan was formed in Pulaski, Tennessee, and was not formed by the Democratic Party. But there's no need for me to browbeat this. I'm sure you get what's going on right now, folks. I'm sure you are all picking up what I'm putting down. The Klan was not founded by the Democratic Party. That's the takeaway here. Now, who was it that supported the the Democrats, as well as the Ku Klux Klan, and this narrative of the South being a lost cause? A lost cause. You have none other than the Daughters of the Confederacy. So let's do this first. Yeah, let's do Britannica, the Daughters of the Confederacy. All right, so the Daughters of the Confederacy, they were formed in 1894. Now, I'm going to go ahead and paraphrase some of this to speed things up here so we don't run out of time, or at least stay within the time frame I'm shooting for. The Daughters of the Confederacy were comprised of descendants of Confederate war veterans. And these Daughters of the Confederacy made it their, their right to life to ensure that any and all information about the Confederate soldiers was put into a position of being romanticized or being shown as heroes, turning a frown upside down, so to speak. Regardless of their part in the Civil War, they were shown to be valiant and loving husbands who loved their wives. who did everything they could to make sure that they fought for a cause that was just and true. Oh, let me stop this bullshit. Let me stop. Essentially, what they were doing was writing the narrative that their loss was tragic because it was the loss of virtue, that they were the real victors, that they were fighting for the true meaning of family, of, again, of virtue, of camaraderie. They were the heroes in the story. But in order to make sure it looked like that, you have to control history. He who controls, he controls the written page, controls the information of the age. Something along those lines from Dr. Ray Hagan's here. Different video as well. But nonetheless, the story of the South lived on as the victors and the heroes through the lost cause, which again romanticizes the Southerners' loss and the Confederacy's downfall. Excuse me, the Confederation's downfall. Let me do this again. Did I say Confederation like it's Star Trek? The Confederacy. Here we go. The UDC, or the Daughters of the Confederation, played a central role in spreading and perpetuating the lost cause interpretation of the American Civil War, which downplays or dismisses slavery as a cause of the war and instead emphasizes states' rights as the reason for succession, and which has been used to serve the goals of white supremacists. The Daughters of the Confederation, or the UDC, was instrumental in ensuring that the characterization of the war in textbooks conformed to the lost cause narrative, and it was a prime contributor to the creation of the Confederate memorial landscape of statues and monuments that became increasingly controversial in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Now, you have to keep in mind of all the bases that were named: Fort Bragg, Fort Lee, Fort Gordon. These are all either Confederate foot soldiers or Confederate generals that these bases were named after. Think of all the monuments that we saw being pulled down starting around 2017. These were monuments that were put up after the Civil War was over. These weren't erected during the war or before the war. They were put up as a means of letting people know, don't lose faith in the South. The South shall rise again. Hence, as I said before, the South has risen again, the title of this video. But all that was put in place to reinforce Southerners, to let them know that we are still doing what we can to make sure that the South is remembered as the grand and benevolent entity that it was. BS. Now, again, what we're looking at is the site on Britannica discussing the Daughters of the Confederacy. Well, how about we look at the actual Daughters of the Confederacy website? Let's see what the girls have to say. Oh, whoops. Wrong link. Let's try this again. You know what? I don't think I have that in here. So let me just go ahead and bring that up. Daughters of the Confederacy. Now, here's their actual page. Now, I'm not going to sit here and try and read all this swill for the most part. But let's just go ahead and just take one particular paragraph. The reaffirmation of the objectives of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Whereas the United Daughters of the Confederacy is an organization dedicated to the purpose of honoring the memory of its Confederate ancestors, protecting, preserving, and marking the places made historic by Confederate valor. Confederate valor. Collecting and preserving the material for a truthful history of the war between the states. Again, the lost cause narrative. The loser trying to write the narrative. preserving the material for a truthful history of the war between the states, recording the participation of Southern women in their patient endurance of hardship and patriotic devotion during and after the war between the states, fulfilling the sacred duty of benevolence toward the survivors and those dependent upon them, assisting descendants of worthy Confederates in securing a proper education. We're going to talk about that next. Honoring the service of veterans from all wars, as well as active duty military personnel, and cherishing the ties of friendship among the members of the organization. And you know what, folks, you can read this, like I said, read this swill for yourselves. This is what I'm talking about when I make the statement of ideological subversion. And when I say ideological subversion, again, we're talking about changing the principles, the core values, the tenets, or whatever you want to say, that forms an individual or forms a level of society's beliefs. And this right here is exactly what has been allowed to continue for almost 100 some odd years. When you have a conversation with someone who simply does not believe that the South fought because of slavery, this is where it comes from. It comes from this type of information like this misinformation. All right, now here is the lost cause itself, again, as listed on Britannica. Let me close a few of these tabs here because they're sourcing a lot of information and slowing things down on my side. Lost cause, an interpretation of the American Civil War viewed by most historians as a myth that attempts to preserve the honor of the South by casting the Confederate defeat in the best light possible, or excuse me, in the best possible light. It attributes the loss to the overwhelming Union advantage in manpower and resources, nostalgically celebrates an antebellum South of supposedly benevolent slave owners and contented enslaved people, and downplays or altogether ignores slavery as the cause of war. It became the philosophical foundation of the for the racial violence and terrorism employed to reverse Reconstruction and for the reimposition of white supremacy in the Jim Crow era. Its acceptance in the North as well as in the South facilitated national reunion following the war, but at the cost of the civil rights of African Americans. Again, folks, the lost cause. And this is the narrative that has been perpetuated for over 100 plus years. And we're now seeing coming back. And the descendants of the Confederates, they are actively taking roles right now to try and remove any type of advancement that we have seen amongst anyone who is of a non white nature here in America. Now, last but not least, what I do want to make mention of here is the rewriting of history. Now, you recall when I was giving information stating about the textbooks that the excuse me, that the Daughters of the Confederacy were able to get their information inside of. You still have agencies right now who are looking at this and going across and seeing that there has been um, an influence, depending upon certain regions in the United States, that have been affected by such information. Again, the lost cause translation when it comes to the Civil War. So, the Georgia State University Research Magazine. Now, I happened to be looking for information that could validate what I was stating. Now, this is not the only place, but this is one of many of where they've had discussions about how the Civil War is portrayed in schools and how it's actually written and how it's interpreted and how the lost cause narrative has been doing damage for 50 plus years. If history is written by the victors, then post Civil War America is a rare exception to the rule, says Shara Bohan, professor of educational policy studies in the College of Education and Human Development. Now, this article, I think, is from 2020. But nonetheless, last year, Bohan and her collaborators, including Dean's doctoral fellow Wade Morris, analyzed history textbooks published in the decades after Reconstruction and found the lost cause narrative, which advocates a heroic view of the Confederacy, not only predominated in Southern classrooms, but crept into history textbooks used across the North as well. By the 1930s, the so-called mint julep portrayals of figures including John Brown, John Wilkes Booth, and Nathan Bedford Forrest, by the way, who was the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, had become the national consensus. This recasting of history carries on today, says Bohan, as publishing companies continue to print different versions of history books to comply with the priorities and educational standards of various states. We spoke with Bohan about her research and the lingering implications of Americans' miseducation. Now, I want people to remember here that the biggest thing that is happening right now is the abolishment or the attempted abolishment of the Department of Education. So, what happens if you abolish the Department of Education? That means that education goes back to the states, which means that now you have more leniency than ever to tell history the way that you want to. And this is already a problem, as I'm pointing out at this point in time. So, if the Department of Education is allowed to be completely gutted and thrown out, what will we have when it comes to the agreement of history? As I said before at the very beginning, we're looking at the dismissal of shared values, dismissal of facts, the dismissal of reality. And doing away with the Department of Education means that we will not have children or the next generations who will all share the same information. All right, this is bad, folks, but we still have time, hopefully, to do something about it. After the Civil War from the 1870s through the 1910s, public schooling became more widespread in the South, and Confederate sympathizers wanted to ensure that their children received an appropriate education on Southern history and culture. To that end, Southern states developed statewide adoption policies for textbooks. This allowed the state textbook committees to control content by demanding changes or threatening to cancel book contracts unless the publishers acquiesced. Today, most of the states with statewide textbook adoption policies are still in the South. So I'm not going to go ahead and continue on with that because you see where this is going. Hence why I say again that the ideological subversion of Americans has been going on since the Civil War. And we're seeing all of that come to a climax right about now with, again, the dismissal of shared value, fact, and reality. Where's it all going? All right, so let's get off that topic for a second now, and let's go ahead and look at the main thing that I would like to make sure we leave this conversation with, which is understanding that the two parties that we have right now, the Republicans and the Democrats, are not the same parties that they were back in 1965. That was when the ideology switched. But before you guys sit here and say, oh, you're lying, John, you're lying, understand this. Anything that I say to you guys, you know that I'm going to corroborate. This is not my personal opinion. This is fact. This is not left-wing rag or left-wing bias or what you're going to hear from folks who disagree with the narrative because it does not support theirs. Facts do not choose sides. Let's get on with it. So a fair amount of the information that I'm bringing up right now, can be cross-referenced with what we've seen in this short hour here. We're coming up on an hour. So let's go ahead and make sure that we get this going here because it is hard to try and compress files that get to a certain size. So again, as I said before, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, the views that they have right now are not the same. From here, we see the Democratic and Republican parties have not always had the same ideals that they have today. In fact, America's two dominant political parties have essentially flipped ideologies in the time since they were founded. You don't have to take my word for it. You don't even have to like the information that is up here. But as we go through these last few facts here, you'll see that anything that I'm stating here will be corroborated by any other fact that is produced here. Always, folks, go look for yourselves. The Democratic Party was founded in 1828, while the Republican Party dates back to 1854. This is after the Whig Party. In its early years, the Republican Party was considered quite liberal, while the Democrats were known for staunch conservatism. This is the exact opposite of how each party would be described today. This change did not happen overnight, however. Instead, it was a slow set of changes and policies that caused the great switch. So, again, there's no need for us to go back and relive what we've discussed between the Civil War, the Reconstruction period, and Jim Crow. Let's go ahead and just go right to the new century. So ideally, we're talking about 1929. Hoover was in the office. There was a stock market crash. The economy crashed in 1929. And of course, now it came down to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to institute change. A Democrat, Franklin D. Roosevelt, sensed the need for change. Now, what he wanted to do was look for a better way of taking care of people. And he advocated government intervention, financial assistance, and concern for the welfare of the people. Now, this started the slow burn here, or it lit the fuse towards, better way to put it, towards civil rights. Now, what's not seen here, and then you have to cross-reference in a different site, is that Eleanor Roosevelt was a strong proponent for civil rights. So this is one of the things most likely that helped in the background. Now, I say that because, excuse me, we all know that husbands and wives have their relationships. Now, I'm not going to say that it was her who made him decide civil rights was a key issue. But again, she was a proponent of civil rights. He wanted to see better for the community, for everyone. He looked towards civil rights as being a solution. So I remember a line from a movie called My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where the wife said, "Even though my husband may be the head, I am the neck, and I can determine which direction he looks in." So that's not the case to say that she determined how he looked at civil rights, but just understand that he had someone to discuss this with, but when he was at home. But of course, when he's at the job, he's got more people to have a discussion with, and his job is to convince others that civil rights is something to be considered, and it was. Now, before I jump over to Wikipedia, let's keep going here. Let's get down to the brass tacks here. Where are we? We're at an hour and 2 minutes. Okay, I need to step this up. Uh, you know what? It's only 5 or 6 paragraphs. Let's go ahead and just read them. Race and equality began to return to the center of politics in the 1950s and 60s. Race did not necessarily fall into a party viewpoint at this point. Instead, it was more of a regional issue. Southern Democrats and Republicans both opposed the early civil rights movement. Now, keep in mind, both Republicans and Democrats were slave owners at one point in time. It was more of a regional issue. Southern Democrats and Republicans both opposed civil rights movement, while Northern Democrats and Republicans began to support legislation as the movement picked up. In 1964, Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. Now, keep in mind, he was able to do so because Kennedy had been assassinated the year before. And as I stated, Martin Luther King had opened, or if I didn't state in this video, Martin Luther King and Kennedy had opened a channel of communication between the two. So one of the main things that had blacks voting for Lyndon B. Johnson was because of the fact during the 64 campaign, Barry Goldwater opposed the new law, meaning the Civil Rights Act, arguing that it expanded the power of the federal government to a dangerous level. Now, in other videos, and I will see if I can link that or put you onto that pathway, you also saw Ronald Reagan, who gave a very impassionate speech supporting Barry Goldwater. It was this argument that led to a final decisive switch. Black voters who had historically been loyal to the Republican Party because of the 1866 Civil Rights Act had already been switching to the Democratic Party. Now, again, remember the Republicans, they were the liberal ones prior to 1965. So, because they were responsible for the emancipation of blacks, blacks voted Republican. That is the main reason. Blacks voted Republican because the Republican Party of old was known to support black endeavors. That was not the case after the 1964 Civil Rights Bill and the Civil Rights Act of 1965 were signed. You saw the segregationists leaving the Democratic Party for the Republican Party because you had Republican members who started to say, you know what, we're not really good with the way things are going with blacks getting all these rights, or at least being given the same rights as whites. Now, remember, in 1954, you had Brown versus the Board of Education, where they were starting the desegregation of schools, where separate but equal was considered unconstitutional. All these things were building up into a full head of steam, leading to the Civil Rights Act being signed. Pay attention. However, upon hearing Goldwater's argument against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the majority of black voters left the Republican Party in favor of the Democrats. They saw the Democratic Party as advocates for equality and justice, while the Republicans were too concerned with keeping the status quo in America. It says so right there. As the 60s and 70s continued, Democrats sought reform in other places, such as abortion and school prayer. White Southern Democrats began to resent how much the Democratic Party was intervening into the rights of people. Now, what we don't see here stated, but again, as you cross reference, Strom Thurmond, who was one of the Dixiecrats, a faction of the Southern Democrats or the Democratic Party in 1948, before the election of Truman, he was put forward as the Dixiecrats' choice to be the president, but the Dixiecrats lost. They were short-lived. They were a party from, I want to say, July of 1948 until November of 1940, until the actual election. But nonetheless, Strom Thurmond left the Democratic Party because he felt that they had lost listening to the voice of the people. Again, all of the racists and the segregationists left the Democratic Party to join the Republican Party, hence what we have today. By the 1980s, white Southern Democrats had become Republicans, and the majority of the South was now Republican. The Republican Party now is solidly conservative, while the Democratic Party is the liberal one. Prepare to look at the pushback in the chat or just throughout here, because this is going to send people into a shitstormed, upgraded distortion reality field. Facts do not choose sides. But wait, there's more. There's always more. So as I said, you had the Dixiecrats. Now, as I just stated, the Dixiecrats were primarily a faction that was short-lived, that were upset because during the course of the DNC of 1948, the I guess the push for civil rights was dropped, and they said, "Hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to aim for civil rights. We're going to support this." And of course, they started losing their minds. Here we go. After President Harry S. Truman, the leader of the Democratic Party, ordered integration of the military in 1948 and other actions to address the civil rights of African Americans, including the first presidential proposal for comprehensive civil and voting rights, many Southern white politicians who objected to this course organized themselves as a breakaway faction. They wished to protect the ability of the states to decide on racial segregation. Its members were referred to as Dixiecrats, a portmanteau of Dixie, referring to the United States, and Democrat. Of course, here we go again, talking about the political realignment, of course, the New Deal, and Franklin Roosevelt's view of civil rights for African Americans. While many Democrats in the South supported substantive economic intervention, civil rights for African Americans were not specifically incorporated within the New Deal agenda, due in part to Southern control over many key positions of power within U.S. Congress. Supporters assumed control of the state Democratic parties in part of or in full in several Southern states. They opposed racial integration and wanted to retain Jim Crow laws and other aspects of de jure and de facto racial discrimination. So, as I've stated, it was fierce that the Dixie Democrats did not want to realign and support civil rights for blacks. Let me scroll down. That's a lot of reading here, but let me just scroll down to the piece that matters here. Here we go. Let's pick a well, not really pick a spot, but I want to make sure we look at the Barry Goldwater play in this. Here we go. In the 1960 presidential election, Republican Richard Nixon won several southern states, and Senator Harry F. Byrd of Virginia received the votes of several unpledged electors from Alabama and Mississippi. In the 1964 presidential election, Republican Barry Goldwater won all four states that Thurman had carried in 48. In the 68 presidential election, Republican Richard Nixon, a third party candidate, George Wallace, won every former Confederate state except Texas. Thurman eventually left the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party in 1964, charging the Democrats with having abandoned the people and having repudiated the U.S. Constitution. He subsequently worked on the presidential campaign of Barry Goldwater. Within the next few decades, a realignment took place whereby most conservatives, economic, cultural, and racial conservatives included, migrated to the Republican Party, with liberals on the same issues going to the Democrats, meaning they left the Republican Party, resulting in a more heterogeneous, resulting in more heterogeneous national platforms. The southern states subsequently shifted over time to voting mainly Republican, with the Northeast switching to voting mainly Democratic. But again, don't take my word for it. I'm the guy who's lying, right? But you've seen that I've corroborated and cross-referenced the same information across two different sites. There's more. All right, so that was the Dixie Democrats. Let's look at the Southern Democrats. Oh, come on, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Now, again, the Southern Democrats were the well, the Democratic Party. It was still the Democratic Party. All right, the Democratic Party of the South obviously were the same folks who were against freeing the slaves, but as well the segregationists who supported the actions of the Jim Crow era. So again, where is here we go. Now, this again is talking about the 1964 Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. We're getting pressed for time, but facts are always going to be available. Despite being a Southern Democrat himself, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These actions led to heavy opposition from Southern Democrats. Many scholars have stated that Southern whites shifted to the Republican Party after a civil rights culture change and accepted social conservatism. I'm 3 for 3 in substantiating my argument, am I not? What else do I need to say, folks? I don't have to prove anything. This is the change in ideology that has been discussed for numerous years, that you will not hear from conservatives because they want you to believe that the Democratic Party that you see right now is the same Democratic Party made up of racists and segregationists who still want to trample the rights of blacks, which is not the case. The Republican Party of 1965 is not the same party that you see today. Better yet, the Republican Party prior to 1965 is the Republican Party that blacks mostly aligned with because of supporting their freedom. That ideology is now firmly within the Democratic Party of today, which means, as I said before, all the racists, the segregationists, the believers in the forces of Jim Crow, slavery, all that went to the Republican Party. Take what I'm saying to you right now and contrast the behaviors that is being discussed. Who is doing the most to undermine the advancements of blacks right now? Deporting immigrants, regardless of the fact that they did come into the country legally. DEI, misappropriating or mischaracterizing terms and associating them with black people, which is not the case. Attacks on affirmative action. Look back at the attack on voting rights in 2013. Which political party has been doing that? It hasn't been the Democratic Party. And I'm hoping what I've shown you all will make better sense and give you the truth here to take a look at the ideological subversion that we have been looking at. I shouldn't say it that way, but that we've been viewing since the Civil War. The narrative has been controlled by the Confederacy the entire time because they were organized. It was a long-term strategy, just like the Russians. The Russians believe that we can change American society through the course of 15 to 20 years. But the lost cause of the southern states making the South look like the heroes, they have been working on subverting ideology for over 100 years. And I hope everyone is able to see that as of right now. But before we call it quits here, I want to take one last minute here. Let's take a look at the Southern strategy that is still being implemented today. So, what was or what is the Southern strategy? Short and sweet. Now, again, one last time, Britannica, pro science, fact checked, peer reviewed, all fact, mostly, if not completely devoid of lies. But challenge us if you want, folks. Those of us who understand fact versus fiction won't have any problem with taking truth as it's presented. Southern strategy. In the political history of the United States, a campaign strategy of the Republican Party, actively pursued from the 1960s. Actively pursued, meaning still being engaged in right now, that initially sought to increase and preserve support from white voters in the South by subtly endorsing racial segregation, racial discrimination, and the disenfranchisement of black voters. The strategy has also involved directly promoting conservative views on immigration, taxes, social welfare programs, law enforcement, and states' rights. You know, folks, I think we're done here. There's nothing else that I need to say about what we've endured over the last 60 days or so, almost 90 days of this current presidency. Understand again that there is an attack on the nation right now for people who are of non-white culture. Pay closer attention to what's happening around you, folks. This is not a drill. This is not a joke. The South has risen again. We are looking at the playbook of the Confederacy that has been upgraded and modified into Project 2025 as sponsored by the Heritage Foundation. I've said as much as I can. It's now up to you guys to take this information and run with it. So before we get out of here, hey, you know what happens. Find somebody who knows somebody to tell somebody about what we've got going on over here. If you like it, let me know. Share it if you do. And subscribe if this is what you're looking for. Thank you for checking it out. John Henry, I'm out of here. Stay woke.